The rain fell against the tall windows of Lady Pemberton's ballroom, with a steady, melancholic rhythm that seemed to Eleanor Hartwell the only honest sound in a room full of artificial laughter. She stood at the periphery of the glittering assembly, a shadow in dove-grey silk among the peacock brilliance of London's finest, watching the young women swirl across the floor in their whites and pastels like cherry blossoms caught in a spring wind. Once she had been among them. Once, 10 years ago, she had worn white and danced until dawn, and believed the world held nothing but promise. Now, at 35, she had learned to find a different sort of peace in observation, in the quiet acceptance of a life that had chosen a solitary path. The whispers never quite reached her ears directly, but she felt them nonetheless, the way one feels the weight of eyes in a crowded room. Poor Eleanor Hartwell, they would murmur behind painted fans. A spinster now, and at her age, well, there's no hope of anything changing. She had stopped minding, mostly. There was a strange freedom in being dismissed, in no longer bearing the burden of expectation. She sipped her champagne and allowed herself a small private smile as young Miss Weatherby stumbled through a quadrille, her face flushed with embarrassment and determination. Youth was so earnest, so certain that every misstep mattered enormously. Eleanor had learned that very little mattered as much as one believed in the moment. The ballroom doors opened with a gust of damp air that set the candles flickering, and the quality of sound in the room changed instantly. Conversations faltered, laughter caught in throats. The orchestra seemed to play a measure behind itself. Eleanor glanced up and felt something in her chest constrict, a sensation she had thought herself long past feeling. Julian Blackwood, Duke of Ashford, stood in the doorway like a dark prophecy made flesh. He wore black superfine, his cravat severe and perfectly tied, his expression, the one that had earned him his reputation, cold, assessing, utterly devoid of mercy. Society called him ruthless, and society, for once, was not engaging in hyperbole. He had destroyed 3 competitors in the shipping trade just last year and reduced a rival's fortune to dust with a series of calculated maneuvers that left even hardened businessmen shaking their heads in reluctant admiration and fear. He never smiled, he never danced. He attended these gatherings rarely, and when he did, it was with the air of a man observing insects under glass. His eyes swept the ballroom with that characteristic dismissive efficiency, passing over debutantes and dowagers alike, and then impossibly, inexplicably, they stopped. On her. Eleanor's breath caught. Across the sea of silk and jewels, across the expanse of polished floor, Julian Blackwood's dark eyes locked with hers, and for one suspended moment, the rain and the music and the whispered gossip fell away into profound, ringing silence. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. 10 years ago, Eleanor had been 25 and engaged to marry Thomas Whitmore, a gentleman of modest fortune and immodest kindness, whose smile had been warm as summer, and whose plans for their future had included a small estate in Derbyshire and a library he promised to fill with all her favorite volumes. She had loved him with the straightforward affection of a woman who believed love was meant to be comfortable, companionable, safe. Julian Blackwood had been present in her life then, though always at a distance, a friend of her late father's, nearly a decade her senior, quiet and watchful at dinner parties, offering polite conversation that never strayed beyond the bounds of propriety. She had thought nothing of the way his eyes sometimes followed her across a room, had attributed his occasional visits to her father's study to business matters or masculine fellowship. He had been simply there, a fixture, unremarkable except for an intensity that occasionally flickered behind his reserved manner like lightning behind clouds. Thomas had died 3 weeks before their wedding, thrown from his horse on a morning ride, his neck broken before he hit the ground. The world had ended for Eleanor in the span of a heartbeat. She had retreated from society as one retreats from a fire, instinctively, completely, finding refuge in her small inheritance and smaller house, where the walls did not echo with congratulations for a wedding that would never occur. Well-meaning friends had told her time would heal, that she was young enough to marry again, that Thomas would have wanted her to find happiness. She had nodded and served them tea and never invited them back. Solitude became her companion, books her solace, and the years passed with surprising swiftness when one expected nothing from them. What she had not known, what no one had known, was that Julian Blackwood had transformed in those same years into something society barely recognized. The quiet, reserved man who had managed his estates with competent dignity became a force of calculated destruction in the world of business and finance. He acquired companies with surgical precision, dismantled competitors with cold efficiency, built an empire on the rubble of other men's ambitions. Society whispered that he had no heart, that something essential had been carved out of him, leaving only ambition and ice. Eligible women pursued him for his title and fortune, but he rebuffed every advance with such arctic dismissal that eventually they stopped trying. Matchmaking mamas learned to steer their daughters away from the Duke of Ashford, who clearly preferred his ledgers to any living woman. He attended society events rarely, smiled never, and conducted himself with the warmth of a January frost. No one could identify the moment of his transformation, could not point to a specific tragedy or loss that had turned him from man to marble. He had simply changed, as autumn changes to winter, inexorably and completely. And no one, not his closest associates, not the society gossips who made it their business to know everything, could explain why a duke of his standing, his wealth, his position, remained so resolutely, almost defiantly, unmarried. He moved through the crowd with the deliberate grace of a man accustomed to people stepping aside, and they did, conversations dying in his wake like flowers touched by frost. Eleanor's instinct was to retreat, to slip away through the doors that led to the terrace, but something pride, perhaps, or simply the paralysis of shock, kept her fixed in place as Julian Blackwood crossed the ballroom toward her with single-minded purpose. She had not spoken to him in years, had seen him only at a distance at perhaps 3 social gatherings in the past decade, and each time she had been struck by how thoroughly he had become a stranger, how completely the man she vaguely remembered from her father's study had been replaced by this cold, forbidding figure. He stopped before her and bowed with impeccable formality, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Miss Hartwell," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, low and measured, though something beneath the careful control made it vibrate with tension. "Your Grace," she replied, curtsying, her heart beating an irrational rhythm against her ribs. The silence stretched between them, while the entire ballroom watched with barely concealed fascination. Julian seemed utterly indifferent to their audience, his attention focused on Eleanor with an intensity that felt almost physical. "I hope you are well," he said, and the mundane words sounded strange in his mouth, as though he were speaking a foreign language. "I am, thank you. And you?" The formality was absurd, stilted, yet neither seemed capable of breaking through it to something more natural. "Well enough." Another pause, and then, with the air of a man stepping off a cliff, he continued, "I wonder if I might have permission to call upon you, Miss Hartwell, at your home, at your convenience." The collective intake of breath from the surrounding crowd was audible even over the orchestra. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, felt the weight of 100 curious eyes. Your Grace, I don't understand. We are barely acquainted, and we were acquainted once," he interrupted, something fierce flashing in his expression before he controlled it. "I knew your father. I knew you before." He did not finish the sentence, but she understood his meaning. Before Thomas died, before she retreated from the world, before everything ended. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly, aware of how inadequate the words were, how they failed to encompass the gulf of years and grief between then and now. "Yes," he agreed, his jaw tightening. "It was." He seemed to be waging some internal battle, his hands clenched at his sides. "I am asking permission to renew our acquaintance, Miss Hartwell. I would consider it a great honor if you would receive me." Eleanor's confusion deepened into something approaching alarm. This made no sense. A duke, particularly this duke, did not seek out the company of 35-year-old spinsters with neither beauty nor fortune to recommend them. "Your Grace, I cannot imagine what purpose." "I have waited long enough," he said, and the words carried such weight, such barely restrained emotion, that Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Please, Eleanor, allow me to call upon you." The use of her Christian name, spoken so quietly that perhaps only she heard it, decided her. Against all reason, against every instinct of self-preservation that warned her this could only lead to confusion and pain, she heard herself say, "Very well, Thursday afternoon, if that suits you." The relief that crossed his features was so profound, so unguarded, that for a moment she glimpsed something beneath the ruthless facade, something raw and desperate and entirely human. Thursday arrived with unseasonable warmth, sunlight streaming through Eleanor's modest sitting room, windows and illuminating every worn corner, every faded cushion, every evidence of genteel poverty that she had learned to ignore, but now saw with painful clarity through the eyes of an expected guest. When the knock came at precisely 3 o'clock, her housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, showed the Duke of Ashford into the small room, where he seemed immediately too large, too vital, his presence overwhelming the delicate furniture and pale wallpaper like a hawk in a canary's cage. He carried a package wrapped in brown paper, which he presented to her with a stiff bow. "I thought you might appreciate these," he said, and when Eleanor unwrapped the parcel, her hands stilled. 3 volumes, leather-bound and clearly expensive first editions of poetry. She had once mentioned loving in a conversation so long ago she had forgotten it herself, though apparently he had not. "Your Grace, these are far too valuable, I cannot possibly. They are a gift between friends," he said firmly. "Your father once told me you read Milton's Paradise Lost 7 times one summer. I thought perhaps you might enjoy having your own copy rather than relying on lending libraries." She had been 16 that summer, consumed with questions of destiny and free will that the epic poem had seemed to address. That her father had mentioned this to Julian, that Julian had remembered across nearly 20 years, created a strange ache in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly, running her fingers over the embossed leather. "This is extraordinarily thoughtful." They sat, and Eleanor poured tea with hands that were steadier than her racing thoughts. The conversation was excruciatingly proper remarks about the weather, observations about mutual acquaintances neither had seen recently, careful questions about how she spent her days. Julian sat with perfect posture on her small sofa, holding his teacup with a delicacy that seemed at odds with his reputation for ruthlessness. And Eleanor found herself watching his hands, noting how they trembled almost imperceptibly, how his knuckles were white with tension. When he reached for the teapot to refill his cup, the slight shake of his fingers made the china rattle softly, and he set it down quickly, color rising along his sharp cheekbones. He was nervous, she realized with astonishment. This man who faced down opponents in business without flinching, who was said to negotiate million-pound contracts with ice in his veins, was nervous in her shabby sitting room, drinking mediocre tea and making stilted conversation about whether the spring had been wetter than usual. The realization did something to her own anxiety, softened it somehow, made her feel less like a specimen under examination and more like a fellow participant in this strange, uncomfortable dance. "I should take my leave," he said after precisely 30 minutes, rising with obvious reluctance. "I would not wish to overstay welcome on a first visit." "You have been a perfect guest, Your Grace," Eleanor said, and meant it, despite or perhaps because of the awkwardness. At the door he paused, seeming to wrestle with words he could not quite speak. "May I call again?" he finally asked, "if it would not be an imposition." "You may," Eleanor heard herself say, and watched something like relief smooth the tension from his features. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her narrow bed, turning the visit over in her mind like a puzzle whose pieces would not fit together no matter how she arranged them. What did he want? What purpose could these visits possibly serve? And why, after years of silence, had he suddenly appeared in her life with his expensive gifts and trembling hands and eyes that watched her as though she were something precious he feared might disappear? Weeks passed, and Julian Blackwood arrived at Eleanor's door every Tuesday and Friday afternoon with the regularity of the tide, always precisely at 3 o'clock, always staying exactly 30 minutes, always bringing some small gift, a volume of poetry, a rare edition of essays, once the exquisite set of watercolors, when he learned she had taken up painting to occupy her solitary hours. They spoke of literature and philosophy, of books they had read and ideas they had pondered, and gradually the stilted formality began to ease into something more natural, though Julian remained always proper, always careful to maintain the exact distance propriety required. He never touched her beyond the brush of fingers when handing her a teacup, never allowed his gaze to linger too long, never said anything that could not have been overheard by the most exacting chaperone. And yet there was something in the way he listened when she spoke, as though every word she uttered was sacred text requiring careful study, something in the way he seemed to breathe differently in her presence that made Eleanor feel seen in a way she had not felt since Thomas died, perhaps in a way she had never felt at all. Society, naturally, was ablaze with speculation. Eleanor heard the whispers through her sister Claire, who arrived one Tuesday morning with her face set in lines of sisterly concern and determination. "You must tell me what is happening between you and the Duke of Ashford," Claire said without preamble, settling herself on Eleanor's sofa with the air of one prepared for a lengthy interrogation. "Everyone is talking about his visits. Eleanor, do you understand what manner of man he is?" Eleanor set down her teacup with measured calm, though her heart had begun to beat faster. "He is a gentleman who calls upon me for conversation. There is nothing scandalous in that. He destroys business rivals without mercy," Claire said bluntly. "Lord Pembroke lost everything to him last year, everything, Eleanor. His estate, his investments, all of it, because he dared to compete with Ashford in some shipping venture. The man was ruined so thoroughly he had to flee to the continent. And there are others, a dozen others who have learned too late, that crossing the Duke of Ashford is tantamount to signing one's own financial death warrant." Eleanor felt a flicker of something defensive rise in her chest. "Business is not drawing-room conversation, Claire. Men compete, and some lose. That does not make the victor a villain. But the way he does it, Eleanor, with such cold calculation, such absolute lack of compassion, they say he feels nothing, that he is incapable of normal human warmth." Claire leaned forward, her eyes searching her sister's face. "Why would such a man suddenly develop an interest in you? What could he possibly want?" The question stung. Though Eleanor knew her sister meant no cruelty, it was simply the logical inquiry anyone would make. What would a wealthy, titled duke want with a penniless spinster, a decade past her prime? "I do not know what he wants," Eleanor said quietly, "but he has been nothing but courteous and kind in my presence. Perhaps, Claire, people are more complex than their reputations suggest. Perhaps the ruthless duke is simply a man who is lonely, as I am lonely, and finds some comfort in conversation with someone who expects nothing from him." Claire's expression softened. "Oh, Ellie, please be careful. I could not bear to see you hurt again." After her sister left, Eleanor sat in the afternoon stillness and asked herself the question she had been avoiding for weeks. Why did she feel drawn to Julian Blackwood? He was severe, guarded, wrapped in a reputation for coldness that apparently was well earned. And yet when he sat in her modest sitting room and discussed Paradise Lost with genuine passion, lighting his dark eyes, when his hands trembled as he poured tea, when he listened to her opinions on philosophy as though they mattered profoundly, she felt something she had thought dead inside her stir back to tentative, frightening life. The rain came suddenly on a Friday afternoon in late April, a deluge that turned the streets to rivers and sent pedestrians fleeing for cover beneath shop awnings and carriage porches. Eleanor had assumed Julian would not come, that even his punctuality had limits when faced with such weather. But at 3 o'clock precisely, her bell rang, and Mrs. Davies showed him in dripping wet, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his coat sodden despite the umbrella he carried. "Your Grace, you're soaked through," Eleanor exclaimed, rising immediately. "You should not have come out in such weather." "I gave my word I would be here," he said simply, as though the promise of a social call held the same weight as a legal contract. Water pooled on her floor around his boots, and his shoulders were shaking, whether from cold or something else. She could not tell. Eleanor made a decision that would have scandalized her sister. "You must remove your coat and dry by the fire. I will not have you catching your death for the sake of propriety in my sitting room." For a moment, she thought he might refuse, saw the instinct toward formality war with practicality in his expression, but then he shrugged out of the heavy coat, revealing a waistcoat and shirt beneath that were also damp. She hung the coat near the fire and gestured him to the chair closest to the flames, noting how the firelight caught in his dark hair, illuminating threads of silver at his temples she had not noticed before. She poured tea with hands that were oddly unsteady, aware of him in a way that felt different from their previous visits, more immediate, more real. The careful distance they had maintained seemed to have been washed away with the rain, leaving something raw and undefended in its place. "Do you ever feel," Julian said suddenly, his voice low, "as though you are living in a house with 100 rooms, and every single one of them is empty?" Eleanor stilled, the teapot suspended over his cup. He was staring into the fire, his profile sharp and somehow defeated in the flickering light. "I have a vast estate," he continued, as though unable to stop now that he had begun. "Ashford Manor has 47 rooms. I have walked through all of them, and the silence is so profound, it feels like a physical presence. I have everything a man could want: wealth, position, power, and it all echoes with emptiness." She set down the teapot carefully, her heart aching with recognition. "Yes," she said softly, "I know exactly what you mean. This house has only 6 rooms, but each one is just as empty. Sometimes I speak aloud simply to hear a voice, even if it is only my own." He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression cracked open, revealing depths of loneliness that mirrored her own. "How do you bear it?" he asked, and she heard genuine need in the question, as though her answer might provide salvation. "I read," she said. "I paint. I walk in the park and watch families and tell myself I have found peace in solitude. And some days I even believe it. And other days? Other days I feel as though I am disappearing, bit by bit, until someday I will simply fade away entirely and no one will notice I'm gone." A smile touched his lips, then the first genuine smile she had seen from him, sad and beautiful and entirely human. "You could not possibly disappear, Eleanor. You are far too vivid for that." The use of her Christian name should have alarmed her, but instead it felt like a gift, an intimacy earned through shared confession. She handed him his teacup, and their fingers brushed, and the contact sent warmth racing up her arm that had nothing to do with the hot china. His eyes held hers, and for a suspended moment, the rain and the fire and the empty rooms of their separate lives all fell away, leaving only this: 2 lonely people finding each other across the wreckage of unlived years. The following Tuesday, Julian presented his invitation with uncharacteristic hesitancy, his words carefully chosen as though he feared refusal. "I am hosting a garden party at Ashford Manor on Saturday. It is primarily a business obligation investors and associates I am compelled to entertain, but I would be honored if you would attend. I realize it is presumptuous to ask, and you would be perfectly justified in declining, but I confess I find these gatherings nearly unbearable, and your presence would make the afternoon infinitely more tolerable." Eleanor's first instinct was refusal. The thought of appearing at a ducal estate among society's finest, of being scrutinized and whispered about, of standing in her shabby best among women dripping in silks and jewels, filled her with something approaching panic. But Julian was watching her with such barely concealed hope, such vulnerability in his usually guarded expression, that she found herself saying yes before caution could intervene. The days until Saturday passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Eleanor stood before her wardrobe with growing despair, knowing that nothing she owned was remotely suitable for a garden party at a duke's estate. Finally, she chose her least faded day dress in pale lavender, purchased years ago for some long-forgotten occasion, and told herself that dignity mattered more than fashion, that she would hold her head high, regardless of how she appeared beside the peacocks of society. Claire arrived Saturday morning to help with her hair, styling it in a manner more elaborate than Eleanor's usual simple knot, weaving in a ribbon that matched her dress. "You look beautiful, Ellie," her sister said softly, and Eleanor saw tears in Claire's eyes. "I have not seen you take such care with your appearance in 10 years. Whatever is happening between you and the Duke, it has brought you back to life." The carriage Julian had sent arrived promptly at noon, and as it carried Eleanor through increasingly grand neighborhoods toward the outskirts of London, her anxiety mounted with each passing mile. Ashford Manor, when it came into view, stole her breath, a magnificent Palladian structure of honey-colored stone that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun, surrounded by grounds so extensive she could not see where they ended. Liveried servants lined the drive, and guests in their finest promenaded across manicured lawns, with champagne flutes catching the light like diamonds. Eleanor's courage nearly failed her entirely, but then Julian was there, descending the front steps with a speed that suggested he had been watching for her arrival, and the relief and pleasure that illuminated his usually severe features gave her strength. "Eleanor," he said, handing her down from the carriage with exquisite care, as though she were infinitely precious. "Thank you for coming. May I show you the gardens before we join the others?" She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and he offered his arm with such pride in his home, pride in having her there, that she felt some of her anxiety ease. He led her past the main gathering toward a walled garden she had not noticed from the drive, and when he opened the iron gate, Eleanor stopped breathing. It was a garden from literature made real. Roses climbed trellises like those in Shakespeare's sonnets, arranged exactly as the bard had described them. Milton's flowers of all hue bloomed in careful profusion. The daffodils beside the lake from Wordsworth danced in a manufactured breeze near a small ornamental pond. Every plant, every arrangement, every carefully chosen specimen represented some literary reference, some poem or novel, a garden designed by someone who knew literature as deeply as she did. "Julian," she whispered, turning to him with wonder in her eyes. "When did you create this?" His expression was unreadable, intense. "I began planting 10 years ago," he said quietly. "I have added to it each year since. 10 years. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning, and Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Eventually they could no longer avoid the main gathering, and Julian led Eleanor through the gardens toward the lawn, where his guests congregated in clusters of expensive fabric and entitled laughter. She felt their eyes immediately, felt the weight of curiosity and judgment, as conversations faltered and reformed around the question of who she was and why the Duke of Ashford escorted her with such attentive care. Julian seemed entirely indifferent to the whispers, keeping Eleanor's hand tucked firmly in the crook of his arm, introducing her to investors and business associates with a formality that brooked no disrespect. He brought her champagne and small delicacies from the refreshment tables, stood close enough that his presence formed a shield between her and the more predatory gazes of society's gossips, and never once left her side. Eleanor had begun to relax slightly, had allowed herself to believe she might survive the afternoon with dignity intact, when the Countess of Wexford materialized before them with a smile that held all the warmth of a January frost. "Your Grace," the Countess purred, her eyes traveling over Eleanor with undisguised assessment. "How delightful to see you entertaining. And Miss Hartwell, is it not? How brave of you to venture out among us. I confess I had quite forgotten you still resided in London. One loses track of ladies who have a delicate pause, retired from society's expectations." The implication was clear, the insult wrapped in silk, but sharp as any blade. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, felt herself shrinking instinctively from the casual cruelty. But before she could formulate a response, Julian spoke, and his voice carried the same cold precision she imagined he used to dismantle business rivals. "The Countess of Wexford," he said, each word falling like ice, "is apparently unaware that true ladies never retire from society. Only those of insufficient substance fade from notice. Miss Hartwell chose solitude, which demonstrates wisdom. You, Lady Wexford, chose your current husband after being refused by 3 others, which demonstrates desperation. The distinction is significant." The Countess's face went white, then mottled red. "Your Grace, I hardly think." "No," Julian interrupted, his eyes flat and merciless. "You clearly do not think, which is why your family's investments have failed so spectacularly these past years. I suggest you return to your husband, who is, I notice, currently cornering Lord Pemberton's young daughter by the rose arbor in a manner that borders on harassment, and remind him that I hold the note on your London house. It comes due in 6 months, and whether I extend that note depends entirely on whether your family demonstrates better judgment in the future. Starting with how you address Miss Hartwell." The Countess fled, her retreat barely shy of a run, and several nearby guests suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart hammering, watching Julian's profile as he smoothly handed her a fresh glass of champagne, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. This was the ruthlessness society whispered about, the cold devastation that left rivals destroyed and enemies broken. But it had been deployed in her defense, used to protect rather than to conquer, and Eleanor felt something shift fundamentally in her chest. She had been afraid of his severity, had half believed the warnings about his heartless nature, but standing beside him now, watching the way he had wielded his considerable power like a sword to shield her from cruelty, she understood that strength and cruelty were not synonymous. He was not heartless, he simply reserved his heart carefully and defended what he valued with absolute, uncompromising ferocity. "Julian," she said softly, and he turned to her with something almost like fear in his eyes, as though he worried his display had appalled her. "Thank you." The relief that flooded his features was profound, and his hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, warm and solid and unmistakably protective. Always, he said, so quietly only she could hear. I will always defend you, Eleanor, in this, as in all things. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose when the last guests finally departed in their elegant carriages. Eleanor had expected Julian to summon his own carriage for her return home, but instead he asked, with an urgency that seemed barely controlled, if she would walk with him once more through the literary garden before she left. She agreed, sensing that something significant trembled on the edge of speech, something that had been building through all their careful afternoons of tea and conversation. They walked in silence past the Shakespearean roses, now gilded with evening light, past Milton's flowers and Wordsworth's daffodils, and Eleanor felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against the quiet like a physical force. Finally, Julian stopped beside a bed of pansies. Pansies, that's for thoughts, from Hamlet, and turned to face her with an expression of such desperate determination that her breath caught. I told you I began planting this garden 10 years ago, he said, his voice rough with emotion barely leashed. I need you to understand what that means, Eleanor. I need you to understand why. She waited, her heart beating so hard she felt certain he must hear it, while he struggled visibly with words that seemed to tear themselves from some deep, protected place. I have loved you since you were 25 years old, he said finally, the confession emerging like something painful and necessary. I attended your father's dinner party one evening, and you were discussing Paradise Lost with such passion, such brilliant insight, and I looked at you, truly looked at you, and felt the ground shift beneath my feet. You were light and intelligence and everything I had not known I was searching for. Eleanor's lips parted in shock, her mind racing backward through the years, trying to reconcile this revelation with the quiet, reserved man she had barely noticed at her father's gatherings. But I was engaged to Thomas, she whispered. Yes, Julian said, and pain flickered across his features. You were engaged to a good man, a kind man, a man who loved you and whom you loved in return. What right did I have to interfere? What claim could I possibly make? I was merely your father's friend, a decade your senior, and you were happy. So I stayed silent. I honored your engagement as any gentleman would. I told myself that loving you from a distance was enough, that seeing you happy was all that mattered. He turned away, his hands clenching at his sides. And then Thomas died, and I thought, God help me, I thought perhaps, after an appropriate time had passed, after you had grieved properly I might. But how could I? How could I present myself to a woman shattered by loss and offer my feelings like they mattered? Like they could possibly matter when weighed against her sorrow. You needed time, Eleanor, time to heal, time to grieve without pressure or expectation. So I stayed away. I traveled to the continent for months at a time. I buried myself in business because work was the only thing that could distract me from the constant awareness of your absence. Eleanor felt tears beginning to slip down her cheeks, her mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what he was revealing. How long? She asked. How long did you intend to stay away? His laugh was bitter, self-mocking. Forever, perhaps, or until I could master these feelings and bury them so deeply they would never surface. I told myself I was being noble, allowing you your solitude. But this year, his voice broke slightly, this year I turned 45, and I realized I was spending my life waiting for a perfect moment that would never arrive. That if I did not act now, I would die having never told you the truth, having never given you the choice of whether my love was something you could possibly want. Eleanor's legs felt suddenly unsteady, and she reached out to grasp the stone wall that bordered the garden path, needing its solidity to anchor her to reality. 10 years, 10 years, she said, her voice barely audible. Julian, you have waited 10 years, loving me in silence, while I thought myself forgotten by the world, invisible, worthless. The anguish in her words seemed to strike him physically. He moved toward her, then stopped himself, maintaining that careful distance even now. You were never invisible to me, Eleanor. Every moment of these 10 years, you have been vivid as sunlight in my thoughts, but I could not come to you. I did not know how to come to you without causing more pain. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it, trying to reconcile the ruthless Duke society feared with this man who had loved her from afar for a decade. The business ventures, she said slowly, all those deals, the reputation you acquired for coldness and cruelty, armor, he said flatly. All of it, armor against longing that threatened to consume me entirely. I could not have you, could not even see you without feeling as though my heart was being torn from my chest, so I made myself into something hard and impenetrable. Every ruthless negotiation was a distraction. Every competitor I dismantled was an outlet for feelings I could not otherwise express. I built an empire of ice because ice does not feel, does not want, does not wake each morning aching with absence. He ran a hand through his dark hair, destroying its careful arrangement. I traveled to Italy, to Greece, to places where your face did not haunt every street corner. I stayed away from London society events because I could not bear the possibility of seeing you, of standing across a ballroom watching you live your solitary life and being unable to offer comfort without revealing too much. The few times our paths crossed, I had to force myself to look away, to walk past as though you were a stranger, because I knew if I spoke to you, if I allowed myself even a moment in your presence, I would not be able to maintain the distance I had convinced myself was necessary. Eleanor watched him pace the garden path, watched the decade of repressed emotion finally spilling out like water through a broken dam, and felt something crack open inside her own carefully guarded heart. "What changed?" she asked. "Why now, after all this time?" He stopped pacing and faced her, his expression raw. "I attended a business meeting in March, negotiated a deal worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, destroyed a competitor who had tried to cheat me, and walked away feeling absolutely nothing. I realized I had become exactly what society whispered. I was cold, heartless, more machine than man. I went home to my 47 empty rooms and asked myself what I was preserving myself for, what noble purpose was served by this self-imposed exile from the only thing I had ever truly wanted." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I could not answer that question, Eleanor. I could not think of a single good reason to continue denying myself even the possibility of your company. So I returned to London, attended that insufferable ball, and the moment I saw you standing there in your grey dress with that expression of quiet acceptance on your face, I knew I could not walk away again. Even if you reject me, even if you tell me you could never care for me, that I am too late, that I am simply a strange, severe man who has inexplicably inserted himself into your peaceful solitude, I had to tell you the truth. I had to give you the choice I denied you by my silence all these years." His eyes held hers with desperate intensity. "I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you for 10 years, and I will love you for whatever years remain to me, whether you welcome that love or send me away. But you deserve to know, you deserve to understand that you are not invisible, not forgotten, not valued any less, because society has deemed you past the age where women are supposed to matter. You matter profoundly. You are everything." Eleanor turned away from him, pressing her fingers to her temples as though she could physically contain the chaos of emotions rioting through her mind. For 10 years she had lived in careful numbness, had constructed a life of quiet resignation, had convinced herself that the death of feeling was a form of peace. And now Julian stood before her, shattering that carefully built equilibrium with the revelation that she had been loved all along, that the isolation she had accepted as her permanent condition was something he had longed to breach for a decade. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "I thought myself dead to feeling, Julian. When Thomas died, something inside me died as well, and I made peace with that. I told myself it was enough to exist quietly, to take pleasure in books and solitude, to be the spinster aunt who lives on the edges of other people's happiness." She laughed, "But it came out broken. And now you tell me you have loved me all this time, and I feel as though I am waking from a long sleep, and everything is too bright, too intense, too frightening." She turned back to him, her eyes swimming with tears. "These weeks of your visits, I have felt something stirring inside me that I thought long buried. When you arrive at my door, my heart beats faster. When you leave, the house feels emptier than it did before I knew you. When you defended me today against the Countess, I felt something fierce and warm and terrifying, and Julian, I am afraid. I am 35 years old, past the age where women are supposed to feel such things, past the age of romance and passion, and all those beautiful, foolish emotions that belong to youth." His response was immediate and fervent, crossing the space between them with 2 long strides. Though he still did not touch her, his hands clenched at his sides, as though it required all his control to maintain even that small distance. "You are exactly the right age," he said, his voice rough with intensity. "You are not too old or too settled or too anything. You are Eleanor intelligent, perceptive, beautiful Eleanor, and age has nothing to do with the capacity to feel, to want, to love. Society tells women they expire like produce at 30, that they become irrelevant and undesirable, but society is composed of fools and cowards who cannot see what is before them. I see you. I have always seen you, and you are magnificent." The tears came then, the first Eleanor had cried in years, rolling down her cheeks in hot streams that she could not control. She had wept when Thomas died, brief, bitter tears that had dried quickly into resignation, but these were different. These were tears that came from some deep, locked place inside her that was finally, painfully opening. "I don't know if I can do this," she said through her tears. "I don't know if I remember how to let someone close, how to trust that happiness is possible, how to believe that I deserve—" "You deserve everything," Julian interrupted, and though he did not touch her, his longing was so palpable she could feel it like heat from a fire. "You deserve to be cherished and valued and loved, with the whole devotion of a man who has thought of nothing but you for a decade. I am not asking you to give me an answer now, Eleanor. I am not asking you to return feelings you may not have or cannot access after so many years of protecting yourself. I am simply asking you to know the truth, that you are loved, that you have always been loved, that even if you send me away, you will carry into your future the absolute certainty that you matter profoundly to at least one person in this world." She looked at him through her tears, at this severe, ruthless man who was offering her his heart with such desperate gentleness, and felt something shift irrevocably inside her chest. She was not ready to name what she felt, not yet, but it was there, a seed of possibility planted in soil she had thought permanently barren, fragile and terrifying, and impossibly, frighteningly alive. Autumn arrived with its gentle melancholy, painting London in shades of gold and amber, and Eleanor found herself transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Julian's visits continued with their established regularity, but the careful distance they had maintained began to soften by degrees, like ice yielding slowly to spring. They spoke for hours now, conversations ranging far beyond the safe topics of weather and books, into philosophy and theology, into confessions about life's disappointments and unfulfilled dreams, into the kind of intimate discourse that required trust and vulnerability from both participants. Julian told her about his childhood, about a father who valued duty above all else, and a mother who died when he was 12, leaving him alone in those 47 rooms, learning to be a duke before he had finished being a boy. Eleanor shared her own history, not just Thomas's death, but the years before it, the quiet fear that she had accepted his proposal more from practicality than passion, and the guilt she had carried that perhaps she had not loved him enough, had not mourned him properly because some part of her had felt relief along with the grief. "I think I was meant to live alone," she confessed one October afternoon as they walked through Hyde Park, watching leaves spiral down from the trees. "I think I was always more comfortable with solitude than with the demands of intimacy." Julian had taken her hand then, the first time he had initiated such contact, and the warmth of his fingers lacing through hers had sent her heart racing. "Or perhaps," he said gently, "you had simply not yet met the person who made intimacy feel like coming home rather than an invasion." The physical closeness grew gradually, carefully, each new touch a question asked and answered, his hand holding hers as they walked, his arm around her shoulders one chilly evening when they sat in her garden watching the sun set, the brush of his lips against her forehead when he arrived, when he departed, gentle and chaste, but full of restrained longing. Eleanor found herself dressing differently, choosing fabrics in deeper colors, burgundy and forest green and sapphire blue, instead of the gray and lavender she had hidden in for years. She bought new ribbons for her hair, accepted Claire's help with more elaborate styling, found herself caring about her appearance in a way she had not since she was 25. She laughed more easily, smiled without thinking, caught herself humming while she painted or read, as though joy had become her natural state rather than something to be carefully rationed. Society noticed, naturally. The whispers changed from pity to astonishment to something approaching envy. "Have you seen Eleanor Hartwell? She looks 10 years younger." The Duke of Ashford is clearly besotted, absolutely besotted. Who would have thought a spinster at 35 could bloom like that? Ha! Claire visited one afternoon and sat watching Eleanor move about her sitting room, with wine-coloured silk whispering around her ankles and genuine happiness illuminating her features. "I haven't seen you alive in 10 years, Claire said softly, tears in her eyes. "I thought that woman who laughed and hoped and believed in happiness was gone forever, buried with Thomas. But here you are, Ellie. Here you are, finally, and after all this time." Eleanor sat beside her sister and took her hand. "I thought she was gone too," she admitted. "I thought I had used up my allotment of joy and would spend the rest of my life in quiet, grey existence. But Julian," she paused, testing the weight of what she felt, the shape of it in her heart. "Julian looked at me and saw someone worth waiting a decade for. How could I remain grey in the face of such devotion? How could I stay dead when someone loved me so persistently back to life?" The crisis came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, in the silk warehouse where Eleanor had gone to select fabric for a new dress, another sign of her transformation. This willingness to invest in her appearance and to believe she had occasions worth dressing for. She was examining a bolt of deep plum silk when she heard voices from the other side of a tall shelf. 2 women she recognized as fixtures of society's highest circles, their tones carrying the particular quality of malicious speculation that Eleanor had learned to recognize in her spinster years. "I still cannot fathom what Ashford sees in Eleanor Hartwell," Lady Thornbury was saying. "She has no fortune to speak of, no connections worth mentioning, and she is certainly past any claims to beauty she might once have possessed." "Perhaps he has some strange wager with his gentleman friends," Mrs. Pemberton suggested with a laugh. "See if he can successfully court the most unlikely woman in London. Or perhaps she has information about his business dealings that he wishes to keep quiet, some form of blackmail disguised as courtship. What else would a duke want with a spinster of 35? The whole thing is positively peculiar. Mark my words, whatever his reasons, they have nothing to do with genuine affection. Men like Ashford do not fall in love with women like Eleanor Hartwell. There must be some advantage we have not yet identified, some practical purpose beneath all his pretty gestures." Eleanor stood frozen, the plum silk clutched in her hands, feeling every word strike like a physical blow. The joy that had been building in her chest for months cracked open, and all her old insecurities came flooding through the certainty that she was unworthy of love, that happiness was not meant for women who had missed their chance, that Julian's attention must have some ulterior motive, because how could it possibly be what he claimed? She left the warehouse without purchasing anything, walked home in a daze, and sat in her sitting room staring at nothing while doubt poisoned every beautiful moment of the past months. The literary garden suddenly seemed like an elaborate manipulation rather than a testament to devotion. His patient courtship became evidence of calculation rather than respect for her healing. Every gift, every conversation, every gentle touch transformed in her mind into pieces of some incomprehensible strategy she was too foolish to perceive. When Julian's card arrived on Friday announcing his usual visit, Eleanor sent it back with a note claiming illness. She could not face him, could not look into those dark eyes and wonder what he truly wanted, what game he was playing with her foolish, resurrected heart. His response came within hours, delivered by a footman who waited for no reply. "Eleanor, what have I done? Please tell me how I have offended you, what misstep I have committed that warrants this sudden withdrawal. I am going mad with worry and confusion. If you need time alone, I will respect that, but please, I beg you, do not shut me out without explanation. Whatever I have done, allow me the chance to make amends. Yours in desperate confusion and devotion, Julian." She read the note 7 times, analyzing every word for hidden meaning, for evidence of the manipulation Lady Thornbury and Mrs. Pemberton were certain existed, but all she could see was distress, genuine and unguarded, the careful control he always maintained, shattered by her unexplained absence. Still, she could not bring herself to respond. The doubt had taken root too deeply, had found purchase in soil that had always been fertile for self-recrimination and fear. She spent the weekend in her empty house, the silence that had once been her refuge now feeling like punishment, and wondered if she had been a fool to believe, even for a few months, that a ruthless duke could truly love a woman society had dismissed as irrelevant. Sunday evening, long past the hour when respectable calls could be made, Eleanor's bell rang with an insistence that suggested the person pulling it would not be denied. "Mrs. Davies appeared at the sitting-room door looking flustered. "Your Grace," I told him the hour was inappropriate, but he insists. Julian pushed past her into the room, his appearance shocking in its disarray. His cravat was loose, his hair disheveled as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, his eyes wild with something between anguish and fury. "Leave us," he said to Mrs. Davies, his tone brooking no argument, and the housekeeper fled despite the scandal of leaving them unchaperoned. "Tell me what I have done," Julian demanded without preamble, crossing to where Eleanor sat frozen in her chair. "Tell me what has happened to make you withdraw from me so completely. I have spent 3 days in absolute torment trying to understand, reviewing every conversation, every gesture, searching for the moment I overstepped or presumed too much. Tell me, Eleanor, I cannot bear this silence." Eleanor stood, wrapping her arms around herself as though she could contain the pain radiating from her chest. "I overheard 2 women talking," she said, her voice barely steady. "At the silk warehouse. They were speculating about why you caught me, what advantage you must be seeking, what strange wager or manipulation could explain a duke's interest in a penniless spinster of 35. She forced herself to meet his eyes, to speak the fear that had been eating at her soul. And I realized I have been a fool, Julian. I allowed myself to believe in something impossible, allowed myself to think that a man like you could genuinely love a woman like me. But they are right, it makes no sense. There must be something I am not seeing, some practical purpose I am too naive to understand." The progression of emotion across Julian's face was extraordinary shock, giving way to comprehension, then to such profound anguish that Eleanor felt her breath catch, and finally to a determination so fierce it seemed to fill the room with its intensity. "You think I have been manipulating you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think this," he gestured between them, his hands shaking, "is some calculated scheme? Eleanor, look at me. Truly look at me." He moved closer, his eyes blazing. "I love your intelligence, the way your mind works through complex philosophical problems with the precision of a mathematician and the soul of a poet. I love that you read Paradise Lost 7 times and found new meaning each time. I love your resilience, the way you survived loss that would have broken a weaker person and built a life of dignity from the ruins. I love your quiet strength, the way you hold your head high even when society whispers cruel things, the way you choose solitude over compromise. I love your understanding eyes that see beneath surfaces to the truth of things, that saw past my reputation to the lonely man beneath." His voice grew more impassioned with each declaration. "I love the way you listen when I speak, as though my words matter profoundly. I love your rare smile and the way it transforms your entire face. I love that you paint badly but persist anyway because the process brings you joy. I love your hands and the way they cradle a teacup like something precious. I love your voice and the particular way you say my name when you are moved by something I have said." He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the tears gathering in his dark eyes. "I love that you are 35, Eleanor, because it means you have lived enough to understand complexity and forgiveness and the value of patience. I love you not despite your age, but because of everything your years have made you. And if you cannot believe that if society's poison has convinced you that you are unworthy of devotion, then society has accomplished what a decade of loneliness could not. It has stolen your capacity to accept the love you deserve." Julian turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with tension, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with pain that seemed to come from some deep, untouched wound. "There is something I have never told you, something I should have confessed months ago but could not find the courage to speak. I was there the day Thomas died, Eleanor. I was riding in the park that morning, and I witnessed the accident." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet, her hand reaching out to grasp the back of a chair for support. "What?" she whispered. His horse stumbled in a rabbit hole and threw him. Julian continued, his words coming faster now, as though a dam had broken. "I reached him within moments, dismounted and ran to where he lay. I knew immediately I have seen enough death to recognize it, but he was still conscious, still breathing, and he knew as well as I did that he was dying." He turned back to face her, and the anguish in his expression was so profound Eleanor felt tears beginning to stream down her own cheeks. "He asked for you, called your name, and then, when he understood you were not there, could not be there in time. He looked at me and said, Julian's voice broke, and he had to force the words out through visible effort. He said, "Promise me you will watch over her, Eleanor. Promise me she will not be alone. She tries to be strong, but she is not meant for solitude. Promise me, Blackwood." And I promised. I held a dying man's hand and swore I would watch over his betrothed. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the ticking of Eleanor's mantel clock and the sound of their ragged breathing. "But the terrible truth," Julian continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is that I was already in love with you. Had been for months, though I had never acknowledged it even to myself. Had never allowed myself to truly examine what I felt when I saw you at your father's gatherings. And there I was, holding Thomas Whitmore while he died, making promises to watch over the woman I loved but could never have, and feeling such guilt, such profound, sickening guilt, that I wanted to die myself." He moved closer, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "How could I come to you after that? How could I present myself to a grieving woman and offer comfort when I was in love with her? It felt like the worst sort of betrayal, a violation of the promise I had made to a dying man. So I stayed away. I traveled. I threw myself into business with such single-minded focus that people began to call me ruthless, and I let them, because it was easier to be the cold duke than to acknowledge the truth that I was a man torn between duty and desire, between the promise I had made to Thomas and the longing that consumed me every waking moment." Tears were flowing freely down his face now, his careful control utterly abandoned. "I convinced myself that watching over you meant leaving you alone to heal, that the best way to honor Thomas's last wish was to ensure you had the time and space to grieve without interference. But the truth, Eleanor, the truth I can no longer hide from, is that I stayed away because I was a coward, because I could not trust myself in your presence, because I knew if I came to you, I would not be able to conceal what I felt, and you deserved better than to be pursued by a man who had fallen in love with his dying friend's betrothed." He dropped to his knees before her, his pride completely stripped away. "I am not a good man, Eleanor. A good man would not have loved you while you belonged to another. A good man would not have felt relief mixed with grief when Thomas died. A good man would have fulfilled his promise without wanting so desperately to claim what he was supposed to be protecting. But I am yours completely, irrevocably, regardless of whether you can accept such flawed devotion. I am yours, and I have been yours for 10 years, and I will be yours until I die, whether you send me away or allow me to stay." Eleanor sank to her knees before him, her hands reaching to cup his face, feeling the wetness of his tears against her palms, and suddenly everything that had seemed inexplicable became heartbreakingly clear. His decade of absence had not been indifference but sacrifice. His ruthless reputation had been armor against unbearable longing. His patient courtship had been the careful approach of a man terrified of causing more pain, of violating a promise made to a dying friend, of claiming what he wanted most in the world through means that felt like betrayal. She saw it all now, the full depth of his devotion, the years of self-imposed exile, the battle between duty and desire that had shaped him into the severe, controlled man society feared. He had loved her faithfully through a decade of silence, had honored her grief, even when it meant his own endless loneliness, had finally come to her not out of manipulation or calculation, but out of desperate, exhausted hope that perhaps, finally, he might be allowed to love her openly. "Julian," she said, her voice breaking on his name, "you have been punishing yourself for 10 years for feelings you could not control. You think yourself a bad man for loving me while I was engaged, for feeling relief when Thomas died. But Julian," she stroked his face gently, her thumbs wiping away his tears, "I felt relief too. I have carried guilt for years because part of me was relieved to be released from a marriage I had agreed to more from practicality than passion. We are both human, both flawed, both deserving of forgiveness for feelings we did not choose." Her own walls, those carefully constructed barriers she had built around her heart after Thomas's death, crumbled completely, dissolved by the force of Julian's raw honesty. "I think I have been falling in love with you these past months," she confessed, the words emerging with the weight of truth too long denied. "When you arrive at my door, everything becomes brighter. When you speak about philosophy or books, I feel seen in a way I never have before. When you defended me against the Countess, when you showed me the garden you planted in my honor, when you look at me as though I am something infinitely precious. Julian, I feel alive. For 10 years I was merely existing, and you have made me live again." He made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, his hands coming up to cover hers where they rested against his face. "Eleanor," he breathed, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like absolution, like everything he had been waiting a decade to say. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed him with all the longing and fear and hope and love that had been building in her chest for months. His response was immediate and devastating, his arms coming around her to pull her close, his mouth moving against hers with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation for ruthlessness, with a reverence that spoke of how precious she was to him, how long he had waited for this moment. The kiss deepened, years of accumulated longing pouring through it, patient desire finally given permission to exist, and Eleanor felt as though she was being remade, transformed from the grey spinster society had dismissed, into a woman loved with the whole devotion of a man who had proven his constancy through a decade of faithful waiting. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face as though she were made of something infinitely fragile and valuable. "Marry me," he said, and it was not really a question but a plea, a hope, a desperate offering of everything he was and everything he had. "Marry me, Eleanor. Let me spend whatever years remain to us proving that you are loved, that you have always been loved, that the world was wrong about spinsters and age and second chances. Marry me." "Yes," Eleanor said through her tears, the word emerging as half laugh, half sob, pure joy mixed with disbelief that this was real, that she was allowed to have this, that happiness had found her after all these years of quiet resignation. "Yes, Julian, yes, I will marry you. Yes to everything." The smile that transformed his face was extraordinary, erasing years of severity in an instant, making him look younger and almost boyish despite the silver at his temples. He kissed her again, and again, gentle pressing of lips that felt like promises, like sealing of vows already spoken in their hearts. They planned a quiet wedding, neither of them wanting the spectacle of a large society affair. A small ceremony in the church where Eleanor's parents had married, with only close family and a handful of friends to witness their union. But quiet as it was, society learned of it within hours, the ruthless Duke of Ashford marrying Eleanor Hartwell, the spinster everyone had dismissed. The woman society had already written off as irrelevant. The scandal was delicious, the gossip relentless, but now Eleanor found she did not care what they whispered, because Julian looked at her as though she were his entire world, and that single perspective mattered more than all of society's opinions combined. Claire wept when Eleanor told her, pulled her sister into a fierce embrace and whispered, "I am so happy for you, Ellie, so profoundly happy. You deserve this, you deserve all the love and joy you thought you had missed forever. And Julian, oh, the way he looks at you, as though you are air and water and sunlight all at once. This is what love should be." The transformation in Julian was remarkable. Business associates who had known only his cold efficiency were shocked to see him smile, to hear him laugh, to witness tenderness in a man they had thought incapable of such softness. He was still formidable in negotiations, still commanded respect and sometimes fear, but something fundamental had shifted, the ice had melted, revealing the man beneath. He walked through his 47 rooms at Ashford Manor, preparing them for Eleanor's arrival, ensuring her favorite books were placed in the library, converting a sun-filled chamber into a painting studio, filling vases with flowers, because he had learned she loved fresh blooms. His staff, accustomed to his severe demeanor, watched in astonishment as their employer hummed while reviewing correspondence, as he smiled at random moments. As he spoke Eleanor's name with such tenderness, it transformed the very air around him. Eleanor moved through the days before the wedding in a state of wonder, trying to comprehend that she was chosen, treasured, loved with a devotion that had proven itself through a decade of patient waiting. She would catch glimpses of herself in mirrors and barely recognize the woman looking back, eyes bright with happiness, skin glowing, mouth curved in an unconscious smile. She was 35 years old, and she was blooming like a woman half her age, proving that the heart knows no seasons when it comes to love's capacity to transform. The ruthless Duke of Ashford, the man society feared and competitors dreaded, had been rendered utterly gentle by love for a woman the world had dismissed. And Eleanor Hartwell, the spinster who had thought her life effectively over at 25, was learning that endings were sometimes simply pauses before the most important chapters began. They were both being remade, both discovering that it was never too late to become who they were meant to be, that love cared nothing for society's arbitrary timelines or the labels applied to those who did not follow prescribed paths. In choosing each other, they had chosen life itself, messy, complicated, beautiful life that had waited patiently for them to be ready to embrace it. The wedding took place on a December morning, when frost painted the windows like lace and winter sun streamed through the church's ancient stained glass in jeweled patterns of ruby and sapphire and gold. Eleanor wore deep blue silk, refusing the white that society deemed inappropriate for a woman her age, and carried winter roses that Julian had somehow procured despite the season. Claire stood beside her as witness, and Julian's closest friend from university stood for him, and the small gathering of guests watched as two people who had waited far too long finally claimed their happiness. When it came time for vows, Julian's voice was steady but thick with emotion, his dark eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "I promise to honor your heart, which I have guarded from a distance for a decade, and will now guard with my life for whatever years we are given. I promise to see you always as you are, brilliant, resilient, worthy of every devotion I can offer. I promise that you will never again doubt your value or your beauty or your right to be loved completely. I promise to spend my days proving that waiting for you was not patience but privilege." Eleanor's own vows came through tears she did not try to hide. "I thank you for faithful waiting, for loving me through years when I did not know I was loved, for refusing to give up even when wisdom suggested you should. I promise to trust the love you offer, to believe I am worthy of it even when doubt whispers otherwise. I promise to see past the armor to the tender heart beneath, to honor both your strength and your vulnerability. I promise to live fully, to embrace this second chance with both hands, to prove that it is never too late to begin again." The vicar pronounced them married, and Julian kissed her with a gentleness that made several guests weep, a reverence that spoke of vows deeper than any words could encompass. The wedding breakfast was brief, and then they departed for Ashford Manor, where Julian carried her over the threshold of those 47 rooms that would no longer echo with emptiness. Their wedding night was tender and passionate, and nothing like Eleanor had experienced in her brief engagement to Thomas, whose kisses had been pleasant but never consuming. Julian touched her as though she were infinitely precious and infinitely desirable, his hands trembling slightly as they learned the geography of her body, his whispered devotions more eloquent than poetry. "Beautiful," he murmured against her skin. "You are so beautiful, Eleanor. I have dreamed of this for 10 years, and the reality is more extraordinary than any imagining." She discovered that her body, which she had thought past the age of passion, was capable of desire that left her breathless and demanding. She learned that Julian's control, his famous ruthlessness, dissolved completely in her arms, leaving him vulnerable and open and desperately, beautifully human. They loved each other with an intensity that came from years of denial, from accumulated longing finally given permission to exist, and afterward lay tangled together in the enormous ducal bed, both marveling that they were allowed this, that happiness had not passed them by after all. "Ah, I thought myself beyond this," Eleanor confessed, her head on his chest, listening to his heart beat strong and steady beneath her ear. "I thought women my age were supposed to be past desire, past the capacity for this kind of joy." Julian's arms tightened around her. "We are not too old for anything that matters, my love. We are exactly the right age, old enough to value what we have found, wise enough to protect it, brave enough to embrace it fully, despite what society claims we should feel." She fell asleep in his arms, and in his house that was now her house, and dreamed not of the past, but of the future stretching before them, full of possibility she had thought forever closed to her. 3 years later, Eleanor stood at the window of the morning room at Ashford Manor, watching spring sunlight paint the gardens in shades of green and gold, and marveled at how thoroughly her life had transformed from everything she had believed possible. In the literary garden below, Julian played with their daughter's twin girls born when Eleanor was 37, an unexpected blessing that the physician had called miraculous given her age, but which Eleanor knew was simply proof that life cared nothing for society's arbitrary limitations. Catherine and Margaret, named for poets Julian and Eleanor both admired, toddled through the flower beds with the determined chaos of 2-year-olds, and their father followed with exaggerated concern, catching them when they stumbled, exclaiming over dandelions they presented as though they were rarest orchids. The ruthless Duke of Ashford, whom business rivals still feared and competitors approached with caution, was on his hands and knees in the dirt, making horse sounds while Catherine climbed onto his back, and Margaret shrieked with delighted laughter. Eleanor pressed her hand to the window, her heart so full it felt as though it might burst. Society had called her a spinster at 35, had written her off as a woman whose life was essentially finished, whose purpose had been fulfilled or abandoned, who would fade into quiet irrelevance until death claimed her decades hence. She had believed them, had accepted that narrative as truth, and had made peace with a future of books and solitude, and the slow, gentle diminishment of all possibility. Instead, at 35, her true life had begun. Everything before even her engagement to Thomas, even the years of grief and isolation, had been prologue, preparation for the extraordinary chapters that followed. She had married at 36, given birth to twins at 37, and now at 38, stood in the morning room of a grand estate as a duchess, a wife, a mother, a woman loved so completely that she sometimes had to pinch herself to confirm she was not dreaming. Julian looked up from the garden and saw her watching, and his face transformed with that smile she had learned was reserved only for her and their daughters, the smile that erased all traces of the severe, guarded man he had been before love cracked him open. He waved, and both girls turned to follow his gaze, their chubby hands waving wildly, their voices calling, "Mama, Mama," with the uncomplicated joy of children who knew themselves loved beyond measure. She waved back, tears gathering in her eyes as they so often did these days, not from sorrow but from overwhelming gratitude that life had proven larger, more generous, more full of second chances than she had dared to imagine. The ruthless Duke had been rendered soft by love, his legendary control dissolving in the presence of his wife and daughters, his capacity for tenderness proving as vast as his reputation for cold efficiency, and the spinster everyone had dismissed had bloomed in her late 30s like a rose that refused to accept the limitations of season, proving that women were not produced with expiration dates, but human beings capable of transformation at any age. Society still whispered sometimes about the unconventional marriage, about Eleanor's age when she married and bore children, about how extraordinary it was that the Duke of Ashford had chosen so unlikely a bride. But Eleanor had learned to hear those whispers as background noise, irrelevant and powerless, against the reality of her happiness. She had everything she had thought forever lost: love, family, purpose, joy, and she had claimed it not in the spring of her life, but in what society insisted was autumn, proving that every season held potential for growth if one was brave enough to reach for it. That evening, after the twins had been bathed and read to and tucked into their beds in the nursery, after the household had settled into peaceful quiet, Eleanor and Julian retreated to the library, where a fire burned low and golden in the grate. She sat in the large leather chair that had become her favorite, and Julian lay with his head in her lap, his eyes closed while her fingers moved through his dark hair in the soothing rhythm that had become their evening ritual. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not attended that ball?" Julian asked quietly, his voice contemplative in the firelit darkness. "If I had continued to stay away, convincing myself it was noble to love you from a distance forever?" Eleanor's fingers stilled for a moment, then resumed their gentle movement. "I would have lived out my days in that small house, reading books and painting badly and telling myself I was content. And you would have remained in these 47 rooms, growing colder and more ruthless with each passing year, until the man I love now was completely buried beneath armor he could never remove. I am grateful you accepted me," he said, reaching up to capture her hand and press a kiss to her palm. "Despite my decade of silence, despite my cowardice in staying away, despite all the years I wasted that we might have had together, you could have sent me away, and you would have been justified. Instead, you gave me everything." She leaned down to kiss his forehead. "And I am grateful you waited, that you loved me faithfully through years when I did not know I was loved, that you finally found the courage to claim what you wanted. We both needed those years, Julian. I needed time to discover who I was beyond grief and expectation. You needed time to understand that love is not betrayal. We found each other when we were ready, and perhaps that is its own form of perfect timing. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly, two people who had learned that happiness often comes not in the expected moments, but in the spaces between, not in youth's passionate certainty, but in maturity's deeper understanding. Dear listener, if you have heard this story and recognized yourself in Eleanor's resignation or Julian's longing, know this: you are never too old to be cherished, to bloom, to begin again. Society will tell you there are timelines for love, expiration dates for happiness, ages beyond which certain joys are no longer appropriate or possible. Society is wrong. Love knows no seasons except its own. The heart does not wither at 30 or 40, or any arbitrary number that the world assigns significance. You are not too old for passion or tenderness, or the consuming desire to be known completely by another soul. You are not past the age where transformation is possible, where new chapters can begin, where everything you thought finished might suddenly, miraculously, bloom into extraordinary life. If you are waiting, if you have convinced yourself that your chance has passed, that you are destined for solitude, that the best you can hope for is quiet resignation, consider that perhaps your story is simply on a different timeline than the one prescribed by others. Consider that faithful waiting, whether you are the one waiting or the one being waited for, has its own profound value. Consider that the love worth having is often the love that proves itself through patience, through choosing you again and again across years and obstacles, and all the voices insisting it is too late, too unlikely, too much to hope for. May you find someone who sees you as Julian saw Eleanor, not as society defines you, but as you truly are. May you have the courage to accept love when it arrives, even if it comes at unexpected moments, even if it contradicts everything you have been told about your worth or your possibilities. May you bloom in whatever season you find yourself, refusing to accept limitations others try to impose on your capacity for joy. And may you rest tonight in the knowledge that your story is not finished, that happiness is patient, that love, true love, devoted love, the kind worth waiting for, knows exactly where to find you when the time is right.